In an earlier module in this unit, we focused on the marginal productivity theory of income distribution to try to explain how income is distributed in this country amongst different factors of production, such as land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And we saw that based on that theory, about 70% of income is distributed to labor, and then it's distributed in a various way. But we know that different factors of production receive different types of income and different levels of income. And so the question that we're going to look at in this module is, does the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, does it adequately explain the distribution of income in this country? Or are there other factors that it's leaving out that help to explain the disparities in income between different individuals, different labor groups, and different people and income groups in this country? So in this module, I'll explain the labor market applications of the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, and I'll identify and describe sources of wage disparities and the role that the discrimination has played in paying different groups of people different wages in the United States. Now, when the market for goods and services and the factor markets are perfectly competitive, factors of production, we've seen, will be employed up to the point at which the value of the marginal product is equal to the price. But the question is, does the marginal productivity theory of income distribution help to explain why some workers earn more than others? According to the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, the division of income among the economy's factors of production is determined by each factor's marginal productivity at the market equilibrium. But what about the distribution of income for different types of labor within the broader labor market? And why are engineers paid differently than pilots or teachers or auto mechanics or restaurant waiters and things like that? Why do they all earn different wages? Why are they paid different amounts of money? So can we use this theory to explain why some workers are paid more than others? That's what we're going to be exploring here. Now, for the AP exam, you need to be prepared to identify and explain the sources of income inequality for the AP exam. And one of the issues that is playing a big role in this year's 2016 presidential election is the issue of rising income inequality in the United States. So this being an important issue, you may get some questions on it on the AP exam, and you need to be able to identify what the sources of income inequality are and why they arise. Now, when we look at two different people who are paid differently, we see wage inequality. Much of this wage inequality can be attributed to factors that are consistent with the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. But there are three well-understood sources of wage differences across occupations and individuals that fall outside of this marginal productivity theory. Three possible explanations for wage inequality that go beyond it would be compensating differentials, wage inequalities, and differences in the quantity of human capital. Okay. First of all, let's look at compensating differentials. Compensating differentials are wage differences that occur across different types of jobs that reflect the fact that some jobs are less pleasant than others. So workers in unpleasant or dangerous jobs receive a higher wage than workers in jobs that require the same skill, the same training, and the same effort, but lack the unpleasant or dangerous qualities. Why? Well, think of it. If two jobs require the same skills, training, and effort, but one is more unpleasant or dangerous, who's going to pick that job unless they're paid more for it? Wouldn't you go for the safer, more pleasant job if you were paid the same amount of money? So to attract people to those unpleasant or dangerous jobs, even though they require the same skills, training, and effort, they have to pay them more money to be able to do that. A police officer in Chicago with a population of 2.85 million people earns a much higher salary than a police officer in Hanover, Indiana, with a population of 3,790 people. They're both police officers with presumably the same training and skills, so shouldn't they be paid the same amount? Well, it's much more dangerous and risky to be a cop in a big city like Chicago than it is in a small town like Hanover. It's much more dangerous to be a police officer in Denver than in Highlands Ranch. So you have to pay more to convince those officers to go to those particular jobs. They perform essentially the same tasks and have similar training, but, with a more dangerous environment, you have to have this compensating differential. Now, some workers, if they work a late night shift, we often call it the graveyard shift, if you work from midnight until 8 in the morning or something, they'll receive a higher wage than a worker who works the normal daytime shift. Even if they're doing the same job, it's more unpleasant to work throughout the night than it is to do the same job during the daytime. People would rather work during the daytime. So to convince people to work at nighttime, you have to pay them more. That's a compensating differential. The second thing that can explain the difference would be related to differences in talent. Okay? A high ability person, by producing a better product that commands a higher price, will get paid more compared to a lower ability person because they generate a higher value of the marginal product. A person who has a high level of knowledge and skill and does their job very well will produce a better product than someone who doesn't. And so the value of their product will be greater, and so they will be paid more for it. These differences in the value of the marginal product translate into differences in earning potential. There are plenty of good examples of how a more talented worker does and maybe should earn more than a less talented person in the same occupation. A very skillful chef will earn more than a chef who isn't quite as talented. A future Hall of Fame football player will earn more than another football player who is barely holding on to his roster spot on the team. A great novelist sells more books and earns more money than a less skilled writer. So that can help to explain differences in wages, differences in talent. Differences in the quantity of human capital are also a reason for wage differences. Now, human capital refers to the accumulated education, experience, and training possessed by an individual. Some people have much more education than other people. Some people have many more years of experience on the job. Some people have much more training. More experience, more education, more training leads people to do their jobs better and to produce a better product and better output. And so the value of their product is better, and so they are paid more money because of it. So some individuals receive higher wages because they have acquired more human capital than some of their coworkers. More human capital is usually associated with more productivity and thus a higher wage. For example, teachers with master's degrees. I have a master's degree. I'm paid more money than teachers that don't have master's degrees. When I taught in New York State, it was required for all New York State teachers to have master's degrees within 5 years of beginning their teaching job. It's not required in Colorado for a teacher to have a master's degree. But I do. And teachers with master's degrees are paid more than teachers without because presumably they have more knowledge and skill and education and then bring more value to the job because of that. So they receive higher salaries. So these three explanations, compensating differentials, differences in talent, and differences in human capital, help to partially explain wage inequality and why people are paid different wages for similar work or the same type of work or with similar skills. But they are all consistent with the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. In other words, all three of these explanations for wage inequality assume that each individual who is paid more is producing a product of greater value than the other person who's paid less, and that explains why they are paid more. So it's consistent with that theory. But even if we account for wage differences in this way, there are still unexplained differences between the wages of two individuals whom we might expect to receive identical wages. For example, here we have differences in wages by education, gender, and ethnicity as of 2013. Now, you can see that white males tend to earn more than white females. African American males earn less than white males. African American females earn less than African American males, and Hispanic males and so forth. But you can see in every single group People who have a college degree earn significantly more than those who have only a high school diploma, and they earn significantly more than those who have no high school diploma. So this is consistent with marginal productivity theory of labor, because we assume people with more education have more knowledge and skill and therefore are capable of producing a higher value product that people will pay more for, and it will justify their higher wage. But let's look at some of these things that maybe don't fall as consistent with the marginal productivity theory of labor. Things that create wage differences that are unrelated to it. One would be market power. For example, market power can occur in the form of unions or collective action by employers, as well as the efficiency wage model. They also explain how some wage disparities arise. So let's talk about these. Let's first talk about market power. James and Ricardo are both 50-year-old truck drivers in Indianapolis. They have the same skills, the same level of experience, and the same safety record. But Ricardo earns about 28% more than James. Why should he, if he's the same in all those ways? Well, because he is a member of the Teamsters Union, which has negotiated a contract for Ricardo and other members to raise his wages above the non-union level in the city. So oftentimes, through collective bargaining, unions will negotiate higher wages for their workers who are doing the same work with the same skills and will be paid more for it than people that are not part of the union. Now, we have discussed how firms with market power have the ability to raise the price of goods above competitive levels. Well, a labor union attempts to do the same thing, to raise wages for the membership above the competitive level provided by the market. Now, today, this isn't as significant. Back in the 50s and 60s, 1/3 of workers in this country belonged to unions. Today, it's a little less than 7%. So unions aren't nearly as effective as they have been in raising wages for their workers through collective bargaining. There isn't a lot of this power left. A union is an organization that represents a group of workers. The union collectively bargains with employers on behalf of the membership, and so this means that the union and the employers will negotiate wages, benefits, and working conditions, and once a contract is agreed upon, the contract holds both parties to the terms of the contract. Union membership in the United States, as I said, has declined since the 1960s to about 7% of private sector employees today who are represented by unions. Declining membership has meant that the ability to greatly increase wages like Ricardo's above the non-union level has greatly weakened. On the AP exam, you should remember that unions act like single sellers of labor. Through collective bargaining, they represent all the workers, making them a monopoly in the labor market. Now, another thing that can explain differences in wages that's outside the marginal productivity theory is the efficiency wage model. An efficiency wage is when an employer pays a wage above the competitive level as an incentive for workers to be more productive and to reduce employee turnover. Now, why might they do this? Well, in many jobs, employers can't keep an eye on their workers every single minute. Okay? So it would be easy for a worker to slack off or for a worker to do a poor job because the boss isn't always watching them. So to encourage them to do a good job, the employer will pay them a wage that is higher than the market wage that they could get elsewhere. That encourages the employee to do the best job they can, even though they're not being watched, because they know if they happen to get caught doing a bad job, they will lose that job and it will be much more difficult to replace it because the other jobs in the market pay much less, if they can even find one. So when jobs pay higher wages than the market for this reason, these are called efficiency wages. It's an incentive that employers pay to get their employees to perform better. And it reduces employee turnover. So workers end up being more productive, and there's not as much turnover, so they don't have to train all these new workers. This can emerge when it's not very easy to directly observe that worker's performance, and it's very costly for an employer to retrain new workers. So paying a higher wage makes sense for the employer because the worker doesn't want to quit and lose this high wage job and try to find another one that wouldn't pay as much. And this reduces the constant need to spend money on training new employees. So an efficiency wage works like a price floor in the market and creates a surplus of workers who wish to have an efficiency wage job. Because there is a surplus of others out there who want this job, those fortunate enough to have the job will work hard not to lose it. Thus, there is a wage disparity between those who have the efficiency wage job and those who, with the same skills and credentials, wish they had it and are working a job that pays less. Another explanation is just outright discrimination. Okay? Discrimination against women, discrimination against Hispanics, discrimination against African Americans. This has historically been a major factor in wage disparities. Oftentimes, blacks, Latinos, and women they've been paid lower wages in many, many kinds of jobs, and it's been justified because they weren't white men. And so this is outright discrimination. So an example would be, Tom and Robert living in Detroit, and they're identical in every way. They both have college degrees in economics from a large university. They are both 28 years old and have been working full-time at the same large bank since they graduated. They differ in only one demographic respect. Tom is white and Robert is not. They also differ in one other aspect. One of them receives a lower salary than the other. Now, if Tom and Robert are identical in every way that should matter to their salaries, occupation, age, experience, education, region of the country, etc., and one of them receives a lower salary, perhaps it is because that worker is the victim of labor market discrimination. If this is truly a case of deliberate discrimination, the employer has violated U.S. law and could be fined, and the victim could sue the employer for damages. Basic supply and demand theories predict that the labor market itself, however, not government regulation or lawsuits, will fix this form of discrimination. Why? Suppose that persons of type Z have traditionally been a minority in a labor market and they've suffered discrimination and they earn lower wages because of it. Well, rational colorblind employers who don't want to discriminate would prefer to hire these workers who are equally productive, but because of discrimination are less expensive to employ. In other words, the value of the marginal product of that worker is greater than the wage they have to pay them. So this employer will maximize their profits by hiring more of these workers who are discriminated against. But as they continue to hire more of them, the market-wide demand for these workers increases, thus increasing the wage, and the wage differences would be eliminated. So according to this theory, the market would take care of discrimination on its own. But though the competitive market should eliminate wage discrimination, we know it still does exist in labor markets around the world. This would tend to cast doubt on the assumption of competitive labor markets. An alternative explanation for persistent wage discrimination is that minorities do not have equal access to the education and training that provide desirable characteristics to the labor market. In other words, if you look at the marginal product theory of income, we would say that, well, maybe minorities have grown up in poor neighborhoods and gone to bad schools, and they don't acquire the skills and education that allow them to produce a higher level product, and they're paid less for it. And that is what causes their lower wages. So it would be consistent with marginal productivity theory, but people would still say, but that's unfair. Because they've been discriminated against in the past, they don't have the opportunity to produce a higher value product. Or there might exist many employers in the majority group that simply have such a strong dislike of these minority groups that they will continue to pay higher wages to workers that they like, even if it is not the profit-maximizing decision to do so. That can happen also. Now, labor market discrimination is not unique to the United States. Economists have found evidence of wage discrimination by the majority group against the minority groups in nations around the world. For example, South Africa. Up until 1994, the law of apartheid was in place, legal segregation of the races, black and white. South Africa was originally colonized by the Dutch. And these white Dutch people that lived there and then were born there came to control the political system through colonization. And they legally separated the races. And then when they found out that they were actually being paid less money for similar jobs than blacks were in South Africa, they created a system that developed different kinds of jobs with different levels of pay for white and black workers. Government jobs, which paid more and the white race controlled, paid much more, and eventually the government took over many industries so that white workers would be paid more and blacks would be segregated into lower paying jobs. Eventually, apartheid came to an end in 1994. But until then, the Republic of South Africa was controlled by its white minority, and they imposed that economic system known as apartheid. So this system that they instituted were called job reservation laws that reserved all the higher paying jobs for the minority whites. And it ensured that only whites got jobs that paid well and blacks did not. Once apartheid was abolished, this system began to fall apart. But unfortunately, large racial differences in earnings still remain even today, because apartheid created huge disparities in human capital, which will persist for many years to come. So, is the marginal productivity theory of income distribution really true? Well, there are two main objections to the theory. One is that suppose we observe two groups of workers, group X and Y, and they appear to have very similar traits, occupations, and human capital. Yet average wages in group X are greater than average wages in group Y. Are we to assume that workers in group X are, on average, more productive than workers in group Y? Are we to assume that white males, as we see here in this graph, are more productive than females of all ethnicities? Are we to assume that those two groups are more productive than African American males and females? Are we to assume that those groups are all more productive than Hispanic males and females? I mean, are we to assume that that's what explains these wage disparities that we see in annual median earnings by these different groups of people in practice? A lot of people look at this and they don't believe that. They don't believe that marginal productivity explains everything that you see in this graph. So these are the two main objections to it. Okay? First, in the real world, we do see these large disparities in income between workers who, in the eyes of some observers, should receive the same payment. Secondly, many people wrongly believe that the marginal productivity theory of income distribution gives a moral justification for the distribution of income. Just because income may be distributed according to marginal productivity theory doesn't mean that that's the right way to distribute income or the moral way to distribute income. Some people look at the current distribution of income in society and conclude that this distribution is fair. The moral justification for this distribution of income is that some people in society are just that much more productive than the others. But if you don't see the distribution of income as fair, then you must reject the marginal productivity theory itself. And much of the debate that we have in the current presidential election is over whether or not the current income distribution in the United States between different groups of people is fair or not. Is it moral or not? That is an economic and political debate that we will continue to argue and debate about in this country. So, does marginal productivity theory work? Well, yes and no. For the most part, we can probably agree that an employer would not willingly pay you a wage that is higher than your marginal revenue product. And this would imply that any two people of equal productivity should receive the same wage. However, we are not naive enough to believe that this is always true. And many people believe that the current distribution of income is unfair and immoral, and not entirely attributable to vast differences in productivity. So the main conclusion you should draw from this discussion is that the marginal productivity theory of income distribution is not a perfect description of how factor incomes are determined, but that it does work pretty well to explain it. It's also important to emphasize that this does not mean that the factor distribution of income is morally justified. It's just that this might explain why it is the way it is. So let's look at a video here on the theory of efficiency wages. Oh, I guess we're not going to view that video. I thought it was available, but apparently it is not. I had seen it before, but they've taken it away. So we won't look at that. Here's an activity on efficiency wages that we will do in class. And now, here is a summary of the major understandings and learnings that we've gained from this module. And this concludes our look at Module 73, Theories of Income Distribution.